President Donald Trump just made Obamacare America's best kept secret. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, men, shocking news from the pages of Medium.com, the blogging platform where Joshua Peck, who describes himself as the guy who was in charge of spending money for Obamacare outreach last year, did the little math for us to indicate that 1.1 million fewer people are going to enroll in the federal exchanges this year because of one action that President Trump's administration took. And that action is to reduce the budget for Obamacare outreach. In other words, email, phone call, TV advertising, and Google search advertising, to reduce that budget to $10 million from its previous $100 million. Unbelievable amount of money. Who would have ever thought, if you just said, how much money do you think they're spending to get people to sign up for Obamacare? Anyway, so, gentlemen, this raises a number of interesting questions. And Bill, I guess the first one that occurred to me is, Joshua Peck says they won't be able to afford TV advertising at all. That's just out of the picture. But wait, Bill, shouldn't the TV stations donate all that time to get people into the Obamacare exchanges as a public service?
No. And the reason they call the website medium.com is because the writing there is neither rare or well done. With special thanks to Gore Vidal. I think it was Gore Vidal's line.
Nice.
So what I'm just completely just flummoxed. You know, they've taken $100 million of our money to get us to do something that we know is abhorrent and terrible. And you think you could run the entire medical program for $100 million, wouldn't you? You'd think that it would be close to that. You're so far wrong. What are you, 4 orders of magnitude wrong? Something like that. The federal government is too big. It's unaccountable. It's a tumor. It keeps growing. $100 million. $100 million to advertise to get people to sign up for this program that nobody wants. Down to 10 million now. You can only imagine how relieved I am to know that every tax dollar I've ever paid in my life is going to be consumed by this and many other people's entire tax burdens for their entire lives. It's consumed now, not even in the $100 million glory days, Scott, but now that my money's being spent to convince me to buy into a system that's doomed, winding down, a political hot potato, and all the rest of it. You know what? I changed my mind. I just realized that Obamacare is immortal. Come to think of it, it's actually well-spent money because Republicans have been talking about repealing this thing for 9 years now, or whatever it is, 8, and it's still there. So maybe it is a good investment.
Well, Stephen Green, it's one thing to say that a product that has very little, public profile might need to throw some money behind advertising. In fact, I'll give you an example from my geek world. This week, the makers of the Essential phone, which is turning out to be not as essential as the name might indicate, have dropped the price from $699 down to $499 under the ostensibly because rather than spend a bunch of money on mass media marketing like the iPhone 8 and the Google Pixel 2 has, they're going to instead give that money back to their customers. Well, as a matter of fact, it's, the Essential phone's not going to sell very well because it's just not that essential. But Steve, we're talking about sweet Obamacare. I mean, this is the most desirable product of the millennium, is it not? So why
sells itself?
How is it possible that Obamacare even needs $10 million, let alone $100 million, to get a mere 1.1 million people to sign up for the federal exchanges? Why do we need advertising at all?
You know what? It's even worse than that. Coke spends millions of dollars advertising every year because they want to keep the name out there because otherwise somebody in front of the vending machine might just buy a Pepsi instead. And Pepsi spends millions of dollars in advertising every year for the exact same reason. They want to keep Pepsi in the front of your mind so that you don't go out and buy a Coke. And it's the same thing with the beer ads and everything else. These are competitors in a fiercely free market for your consumer dollars, and so they spend a lot of money because you want the first thing on the consumer's mind to be your product and not somebody else's that consumers flock to freely to make their own purchases. Now, Obamacare isn't just health insurance, it's the law. It's a mandate. You are legally required to purchase this product if you don't get it from, if you don't get this thing from your employer. You are legally mandated, bound by law, to buy this stuff. It'd be like the IRS taking out ads. Did you pay your taxes? Better pay your taxes. We're going to come collect your taxes. Pay your taxes. And spending $100 million a year on the IRS telling you to pay your taxes. Well, of course you pay your taxes because you're not a tax cheat. And if you are, you go to jail, and you know that, so you pay your taxes. This is the law of the land. And they still felt the need to spend $100 million because the product is crap. Nobody wants this damn thing, except apparently for just enough GOP members of the Senate to keep it around.
It reminds me of that scene from the movie Dave where they're sitting around the cabinet table and Dave says, you mean we're spending, I forget what the number was, let's say $50 million, $100 million a year to convince Americans that the previous purchase of an American automobile was a good thing? And it's like the nonstop barrage from the left that Obamacare was the salvation of the American healthcare system should have been plenty. And I do think, that the question I asked Bill was somewhat facetious, but I'm like, wait a minute. There are public service announcements all the time on television for things that are supposed to be good. We're talking about people's lives here. People died before Obamacare. When Obamacare came along, then people didn't have to die anymore. So we have this thing that is the darling of the left, and yet the leftists who own Hollywood, who own the major news media, who own television, who own the music industry, who own Broadway, who own the art industry, if you want to call it that, for some reason these people can't all come together and say, no, Uncle Sam, it won't be necessary for you to spend a nickel on this because we're more than glad to completely donate our services as actors and producers and distributors and broadcasters. We want this information to get out there because this saves lives. I'll also remind you, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure I do not need to, that we weren't going to have uninsured people anymore, right? How many years have we been going at Obamacare now? And we still are hoping we get another 1.1 million people. There are still millions upon millions of people who are not buying health insurance. They're not getting health insurance. They're either paying the fine or skipping it. And it just doesn't work. And that's why you need the money to advertise Obamacare. It's not because it's some great thing that people just don't know about. The problem with Obamacare is people know about it. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green and the entire Right Angle team at BillWhittle.com, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.